I'm Diane Fenner, and this is the New York City Bar Association's webinar entitled Second Act Careers, Opportunities to Teach Law Overseas. I am the co-chair of the Senior Lawyers Committee of the New York City Bar, and we are the chief sponsors. I participated in the program to teach law overseas, and it was amazing. And everybody here is from the program. So I'm going to say a few words about this nonprofit 501c3 organization, which our listeners can find online at www.seniorlawyers.today. And it allows lawyers who have about 15 years or more worth of experience from a common law country to go abroad to some of the post-Soviet states or states in Asia or in Africa. And I'll let our speakers talk more about the locations. So this webinar is going to showcase the work of the senior lawyer visiting professors. Since its founding, the program has assigned more than 400 lawyers and coordinated nearly 1,000 teaching assignments. It was temporarily closed during the pandemic and is now up and running again with some expansion. Our speakers today include our featured speaker, Dennis Campbell, the founder and the director of the Senior Lawyers Program, and he's coming to us from Budapest, Hungary. We have John Ehrlich, retired King County Superior Court judge. That's King County, not Kings. He's not in Brooklyn. He's an educator and an arbitrator. We have Julia Sullivan, an American lawyer and an English solicitor, and an international arbitrator. We have David Zarski, a retired American lawyer and a former English solicitor. And we have Richard Rosen, who comes to us from New York and, like me, is a member of the New York City Bar. So I think we're going to start with Dennis to give the overview about this program. And Dennis, I'll turn the floor over to you.
All right. Thank you, Diane. And hello to my colleagues again. I think probably the best thing for me to do is give a little bit of history as to how the program started. Like all good things, it wasn't planned. It just happened. And I'm a great believer in fate, and I think fate was on our side in this program. I started out as a law professor at McGeorge School of Law in California. And I was director of the international programs for that law school for a time. While I was at McGeorge, I was invited to a program that the ABA was organizing at Georgia State University in Atlanta. And my dean decreed that I would go, so I decided I would go. And what I found there, this program in Atlanta was intended to, it had one major theme. How do we incorporate adjunct professors as part of the university community? And there were a lot of people at this conference, and it seemed to be, at least among those people, a pretty significant problem. What in the world do you do with an adjunct professor at your law faculty? And it was a common complaint that I heard in other law schools and often at this conference. The problem with adjuncts is they tell too many war stories. And I always liked war stories, so I didn't take great note of that. But in any event, I was kind of surprised that there was such concern about using adjuncts. And the dean at Georgia State invited us at the lunch break to stop into his office for a chat before going to lunch. So 6 or 7 of us went in, sat down in his office, and he reached behind him and he pulled out a file drawer, which was a big file drawer. I was impressed by the strength of his arm. It was packed full of papers, documents. And he said, these are the applications of practicing lawyers who would like to be adjuncts at our law school. And one of my colleagues said, for how many years does that, I mean, over what period of years did you collect all of those? He said, no, this is for this academic year. And then we throw them out. He said, and to be honest with you, most of the applications are DOA, dead on arrival, when we get them. So we don't have any great interest in using adjuncts. So I came away from that meeting being impressed, or perhaps even depressed, about that's too bad that there is that attitude, a negative attitude toward adjuncts. And I had taught already for 2 or 3 years at Esztergom University in Budapest. I taught in Warsaw. So I knew a fair amount about the legal systems in Europe. And this was many years ago. The Iron Curtain was still in place. And I remember teaching many times in Budapest. Hungary was still a part of the communist world, as were Poland and the neighboring countries. And I think because of that, that's one reason there was such a potential fascination with American lawyers. And I thought, that would be a great place to send people so they could tell war stories. Yes, they'd have to pick a topic they were going to teach, but they could really rely on their practical experience, and the students would be fascinated with that. So we began contacting universities in the region. We decided to launch the program. I think it was in spring of 2005, 2006. And the hope was in that first year, and I was quite nervous about it, but the hope was, well, we would get 8, maybe 10. If we were lucky, we might get 12 American lawyers who would come to Europe and volunteer to teach pro bono at these various universities. The fact is, in that first year, we got 50. And at that moment, I thought, we may have stumbled into something good here. And as was pointed out earlier, we've had more than 1,000 assignments now, than more than 400 lawyers who've done the program, and many of them have taught twice, 3 times, 4 times. I think the record is 7 times. So they keep coming back. And why this program is so good for the American lawyers, and I think it is, and for the schools, is that the civil law system is not the common law system. A law teacher in Hungary, in Germany, in France, Poland, they are not the same animals that you find teaching in American law schools. Many of them have no practitioner experience. They're pure academicians. And that creates a much different classroom environment. And when people come to our program to teach, sometimes there were people say, I've never taught before. I don't know, can I do this? Which is an admirable quality in an American lawyer. I think they're not usually unsure of themselves. But this concern I always laid aside by saying, look, you have war stories? Oh, yeah. Tell them, they will love it. And I know when I teach in Budapest or in Warsaw, I don't sit in the front of the, in the back of the room away from the students. My classroom that I use in Hungary, and I've taught in for 20 years, is elevated. I have an elevated desk, so I'm sort of up high above the students. There's a place for me to sit. I can control everything from where I'm sitting. But last spring, there was a problem with one of the videos, and I had to go up onto the desk, onto the platform, and sit at the desk to make an adjustment to the computer. When I came down from there, back amongst the students, I said, I was just struck by something. I've taught for 20 years in this classroom, and it's the first time I ever sat at that desk because I made an intentional plan that when I taught, I was going to be very American when I taught, which meant I asked students the question. I asked them to defend things. I roamed the classroom. Sometimes I sat down next to them when they wanted to put a question to them. They're not used to that. They may have been offended by it, but they were certainly fascinated. And I think I can say that over a 2 or 3 week course, I built a really good relationship with my class. Sometimes I'd have 40 students. Last time I had 58, and I told the school, I can't deal with 58 anymore. It's too many papers to grade, you know. But I'm just trying to make the point that an American lawyer is not the same animal as a European professor. And I think that's a great advantage for all of us when we teach overseas. And I'm sure my colleagues on the screen have had similar experiences. Well, in any event, that's why we like to use American lawyers. The European students like them. We are expanding now, and that's not anything we planned, but a lot of our alumni have said, how about teaching sometime in Australia or in Asia or in Africa? And it was in response to that the last 2 years we started contacting universities in those locations. And now, indeed, we are sending people to Africa and Asia and Australia. So that's how the program has developed. Now, the last thing I would say, and it's an important thing, is these are pro bono assignments. You don't get paid for it. You travel at your own expense. If you fly first class, that's your problem. If you fly on a discounted airline, that's your problem too. However you get there is fine. All of your costs associated with the assignment are tax deductible because, as was pointed out, the sponsoring organization is a registered charity in the United States, registered, in fact, in Colorado. And what happens is we receive from the instructor a list of receipts. Here's what it costs me to teach the course. I have to inspect it, and then I approve it, and it goes back to the participant. He or she submits it in the next tax return for tax deductions. The IRS says all reasonable and related expenses are deductible. And that's what I have to monitor. And I tell you, I had one guy who was teaching here in Budapest. He was teaching for 2 weeks. When I got his receipts, I saw that he and his wife had stayed for 4 weeks at the Four Seasons, and that's what he wanted reimbursement for. 4 weeks at the Four Seasons. I told him, well, why did you stay for 4 weeks? I wanted to be acclimated to the time zone. Okay. But the IRS is not going to accept the cost of 4 weeks at the Four Seasons for a 2-week pro bono teaching assignment. We've had others that I've rejected. A guy hired a car for the 3 weeks that he was teaching and a driver. He didn't want to take public transportation or the taxi to the law school. Although I've been to that law school and I knew it was only about 4 blocks from his hotel. But nevertheless, he wanted to have a driver take him to the hotel and pick him up, but also take him on tours, he and his wife. So they would drive around the countryside in that country. That was not a reasonable expense related to the teaching. But in any event, if they are reasonable expenses, they are deductible. And I think there are probably not too many destitute lawyers teaching in the program, and tax deductions are probably welcome. So that's my summary, Diane. I don't know if that was enough or too much, but I'm always all ears in case you want more. Thank you.
Sorry, I want to mention one more thing about the person who was interested in finding out about compensation. I know we had more than one person interested in finding out about whether they get paid or what possible ways there are of recovering the expense. Because I saw that in the Q&A box. And Dennis, you might want to also add to that the fact that the place where you teach will offer housing. I have done that. There is faculty and guest lodgings. It's probably not the Four Seasons, but I enjoyed my stay in the faculty and guest lodgings, and I saved money by being able to take a vacation and for 3 weeks of it stay for free. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, there's also possibilities of getting some meals, but I just wanted to add that to your answer if you want to elaborate.
Depends very much on the university. I would say it's probably less available now than when you taught, Diane. The universities seem to have less and less faculty housing available. It still is true in some cases. Ironically, when we've had people teach in China, housing is provided, meals are provided, interpreters provided. So they've been well treated when they've gone to China. But we always ask the universities to provide lodging, but we point out it's not mandatory. You know,
Yeah, Dennis, if I could jump in for just a second. I'm scheduled to teach next spring in Estonia. And originally I was considering doing it for 4 weeks. But they said, we can only provide you with housing for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So so after 2 weeks, and I'm out of pocket, my own housing there, or what I think I ultimately end up doing is condensing my course, doubling it up so I can cover everything in the 2 weeks.
Yeah.
That's what's happening with me in Estonia.
You know what? I think one reason that the situation has changed a bit is that when this program started, there was no such thing as the Erasmus program. You know the Erasmus program, which allows students from all over the EU, law students, to select other countries to study law in and come to Hungary for a semester or 2 semesters. And I think that has led to a lot more Erasmus professors being sent, from Vienna to Hungary to teach, or from Estonia to another EU country to teach at that school. So there probably is more of a demand on the housing facilities that the universities have available, and that's particularly true of those in Eastern Europe. They're still not as well funded as schools. And for me, that's just a further incentive. I feel like they need us more than somewhere in France. I will digress for a moment and tell you an early story of my interviewing people who wanted to be in this program. A guy came in for an interview and asked me what we had available in Paris. And I said, well, Paris is not, at that time, we only did Eastern Europe. I said, Paris is not in Eastern Europe. He said, well, it's a lot farther east than London. I said, that's true, but it's not in Eastern Europe. And so he said, well, I'm out then. If you can't send me to Paris, I'm not coming. I said, that's probably a good decision for all of us.
Dennis, thanks for the overview. And I'm going to move on and introduce each of the panelists who are now going to talk about their individual experiences. But before I do that, I want to read a couple of questions that were specifically for Dennis. And then after each panelist has had a chance to chat, we will have an opportunity. I'll try to direct any specific questions that people ask. And at the end, we'll have audience participation again. So please keep your comments coming in and your questions coming in. So one person wrote in, Dennis, Martin Toncliffe wrote in that he would like to know specifically more about the law that allows the tax deduction that you mentioned. He had provided a 2-day lecture in Portugal. It's not clear that it was through Senior Lawyers Today. So if you could, he didn't apparently get paid, and he's asking for a little more information about how one gets paid from teaching overseas.
Well, if you look at the IRS code, you're looking for Section 501c3, which provides that recognized and registered charities in the United States can send somebody somewhere to provide some services, and that can become a tax deduction because it's treated as a donation to the charity. And so you would have to make that arrangement, that commitment, prior to actually doing the teaching. I don't know if you could do it retroactively by using Section 501c3. You'd have to find a charity that would be willing to, in a sense, sponsor you in your activity. But that's how it works for us. And I think we've had this possibility for maybe about 12 years, and we've had no difficulty with people collecting on their tax deductions or being able to use tax deductions.
One last quick question from Nelson Timken. Hi, Nelson. He's saying that he assumes that the experience will count. The experience with Senior Lawyers Today teaching overseas will count if you are subsequently applying to an American law school to teach. Can you say a few words about how this experience is viewed by American law schools?
You mean if you teach for free at American law school and you're sponsored by a charity?
No, he's saying that if you apply to an American law school, how do they view your experience teaching outside of this country?
Well, I think they're impressed. My colleagues can comment on that too, but if I had an application for somebody who wanted, my law school, and I saw that they taught somewhere for a period of time, that just adds to their reserves of experience.
I'm going to go ahead to introduce Julia in a second, but I just want to say, any of you who want to call back to a previous question, please feel free to do so. I'm very, very happy to be introducing Julia Sullivan, who's both an American lawyer and an English solicitor and an international arbitrator. Julia, why don't you introduce your history and bio, as well as go ahead and take the floor talking about your experience with teaching overseas as a visiting law professor with Senior Lawyers Today.
Thank you, Diane. I cannot recommend this program highly enough. It literally changed my life. And I'm thrilled that it's reactivated since COVID, and I'm definitely going to participate in it again. So in 2015, I had been practicing law for over 30 years in the energy industry. I was a practice manager at a global law firm. I was very busy. I had a thriving practice, and I was bored. Busy does not necessarily mean I mean, how many interconnection agreements do you want to draft in one lifetime? That's how I felt. I mean, it was great, and I'd worked really, really hard to build what I have, and I was very proud of it, but I couldn't see doing it for another 20 years. And I had no idea what my Act Two would look like. None. I'd only ever done one thing. I went to a big firm straight out of law school. I went to law school straight out of college. So a friend of mine told me about the SILS program, and I talked to Dennis, and I thought, Well, travel 2 weeks, meet some people, see something new. Why not? So I did a teaching assignment in Lublin, Poland. That one was for 3 weeks. And then I did another 2 weeks subsequently in Krakow. And I became so attached to Poland that I wound up getting an LLM in Warsaw. Um, I also did teaching assignments in Tbilisi, Georgia, um, and in Verdansk, Ukraine, which were amazing. I became aware that I could take classes as well as teaching classes. I've often said I learned more from my students than they ever learned from me. They were learning a common law, market oriented tradition. And I was fascinated with learning from them, which is why I wound up going to school in Warsaw. I became really good friends with them, but in the process of talking to them, learning from them, taking classes in Eastern Europe, in addition to teaching in Eastern Europe, I became interested in arbitration, and I decided that that was going to be my act too. And that was all thanks to Dennis and the people he introduced me to, and the courses he introduced me to. And I've since taught arbitration in Tbilisi and in Krakow, and it really just changed my life. It opened my world to whole new perspectives and opportunities. So it's been great. I went to some cities that I'd always wanted to visit, like Tbilisi. I went back to cities I already loved, like Krakow. I went places I probably wouldn't have gone otherwise, like Verdansk and in Ukraine. And I, uh, I've been to my students' homes. I've been to their churches. I've been to their hospitals. I've been able to tour energy facilities in different countries because that was an interest of mine. I could go on, but I won't. I'm going to put my contact information in the Q&A box. I'd be happy to talk to anybody who's interested in doing this program, tell you more about my experience. I will follow up a little bit on Nelson's question about whether the experience was valuable in terms of maybe applying for paid teaching positions in the US. So I was an adjunct professor at Georgetown for 7 years. And I would say the first year, I probably wasn't that good. It was my first experience as a teacher as opposed to a student. Second year, I probably was a little bit better. By year 7, I sort of knew what I was doing. My first teaching assignment with SILS, I felt like I was starting from scratch. This was a completely different environment. Students had completely different expectations. I think the first time I probably wasn't that good. By the fourth time, I sort of gotten my legs under me. I think teaching an international student body is quite different. I think US law schools are increasingly international. That wasn't true when I went to law school. When I went to law school, there was no international law class. That's all changed. But I think that experience of teaching an international student body is really important. And if US universities aren't placing value on that, they should. So I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to answer questions. I'll put my contact information in the Q&A box. Please call me anytime if you'd like to talk. I think you're muted, Diane.
Sorry about that. I'm trying to keep up with the questions and they're coming in very fast. So we're going to go next to Richard A. Rosen, recently retired from litigation department at Paul Weiss. If I remember correctly, Richard is just back from an assignment in Lithuania. And also, if I remember correctly, Richard is a European history buff. But anyway, take it, Richard.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. So I've now taught in this program 3 times. first in Odessa in the Ukraine about 7 years ago, last year in Budapest at ETLE, and just last month, 2 weeks at the University of Vilnius in Lithuania. There are a few things that I think all of these teaching experiences had in common that's important to emphasize. First, these are the leading law schools in the various countries. The University of Vilnius was founded in 1579, and they attract the most talented, most intelligent law students in their respective countries. But as Dennis said, each of these law schools, at least where I've taught, also are participants in the Erasmus program. And therefore, in any given teaching period, you will have students from other countries in Europe. So when I just came back from Vilnius, I had students from 5 countries, not just from Lithuania. I had students from Germany, the Republic of Georgia, Portugal, and the UK. This is important in my view, because when you think about what you want to teach and what would bring the most value to the students, I at least think about what you can talk about US law that is distinctive and different from the legal systems that the students are accustomed to. So in each of my 3 teaching assignments, I taught a course about an overview of the US judicial system and how complex litigation is actually conducted in the United States. And so that, for example, we had 1 or 2 classes about the US Supreme Court, about the current crisis of legitimacy of the court, about the most controversial and interesting decisions on subjects like abortion and gun control. And by doing this, I was able to draw the students out and get them to talk about how their legal systems are different. For example, in Lithuania, Supreme Court justices on the Constitutional Court are appointed only for 9-year terms. And the appointment process is utterly different from the US. There is no crisis of legitimacy of the Constitutional Court and Supreme Court of Lithuania. And it was very interesting to tease out why that is so. The students, so I should say one other thing. In my case, I taught 5 days a week for 2 weeks, with each class lasting 2 hours. As some others have alluded to, sometimes you can teach for 3 weeks. Sometimes the classes are a little bit shorter. I at least have found that 5 days a week for 2 weeks is kind of an ideal amount of time. The students, in my experience, have an excellent command of English. They are enthusiastic. They are engaged. You have multiple opportunities to interact with the students and the faculty outside of the classroom. The faculty at the University of Vilnius was especially hospitable. My wife came with me. We had multiple opportunities to have meals with faculty members and students. I had a fantastic, very long meeting with 3 justices of the Lithuanian Supreme Court and talked about their experience and really had an opportunity to learn an enormous amount about a different legal system, about a different culture, which is one of the rewarding aspects of the teaching. I will just say one other thing, which is on the subject of whether having this teaching experience enhances your credibility or your resume for purposes of teaching in the US. I can just say my own experience is that I did obtain, and I'm now currently an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School in New York, where I live, where I teach a course in complex litigation. The teaching experience overseas was certainly prominently featured on my CV and on my application to serve as an adjunct at Columbia. And as Julia said, there's no question that planning, preparing, and conducting this teaching dramatically enhances your skills as a teacher, and is really, at least for me, was invaluable in helping me get ready to teach at Columbia last fall.
Thank you, Richard. I see a bunch more questions pouring in, but most of them are not indicated that a particular person is meant to answer. So we're going to do those at the end, and we've got 2 more speakers to go. And I'd like to hear John Ehrlich, who I think a retired judge, and I think you're coming to us from Washington. And so please introduce yourself and go ahead and share your experience.
Thanks, Diane. And just for clarification, that's Washington State, not Washington, D.C. So good morning from the Best Coast. As Diane mentioned, I was a judge. I have been in the practice of law for now about 43 years and 20 years as a litigator, trial attorney, doing legal malpractice, defense work, commercial litigation and such. And then went on the bench in the year 2001, and started as an adjunct professor in 2008 at Seattle University School of Law, teaching professional responsibility. So teaching has always been one of my passions. And my other passion is traveling. I've now been to 113 countries. Not so many when I started with the SILS program. And when we refer to SILS, it's a senior lawyers program. It's Center for International Legal Studies is what we refer to as SILS. And so started at SU at 2008, was a judge, and I don't recall specifically how I found out about this program, but I do recall I put in an application. And well before COVID and Zoom, Dennis and I had a video conference, which I thought was pretty cool, being interviewed by this person overseas, and the fact that we could do that. So I was accepted into the program in the spring of 2014 and did a 1-week training in Salzburg, Austria in March of 2014 at the beautiful Leopoldskone, which is the palace where they filmed part of The Sound of Music. And Dennis, I don't believe we're doing this training in person any longer, but at the time it was a fantastic experience. Just being told that even if you teach in an American university, American law school, your experience in an Eastern European or Russian law school is going to be very different. For example, there isn't the interaction, there isn't the Socratic method. It's much more lecture style. And I decided I wasn't going to put up with that when I lectured. So I made sure that my students interacted with me because I said I thought they were much more interesting than I was, and I wanted to hear from them as well. So 6 months after my training in Salzburg, I was off to Russky Island. That's actually the name of it, right off of the city of Vladivostok, Russia. So about far east Russia as you can get. And Russky Island was well known as a closed military base during the Cold War. It was converted. It actually was the site for, after Russia opened up, the Soviet Union broke up and Russia started opening up. Russia sponsored an Asian Pacific conference on Russky Island. And then after the conference was over, the buildings were converted to classrooms and dormitories, one of which I was put up in for a couple of weeks. So there's a question about where you put up, what expenses were paid. And all of my assignments, I was typically put up by the university. So I was staying in this, what they called faculty housing, but it was actually a dorm. They all looked the same, even though they were no longer Soviet. All their buildings, they had about 10 or 12 that all looked the same. 6 of them were dorms and 6 of them were hotels. They were identical, except the hotels had a concierge on the first floor. But to show you how luxurious it was, first day, I went to get some water out of the sink, and out came tap water, which was brown. I immediately contacted my bailiff back in Seattle, because at the time I was assigned to Juvenile Hall, which was a very, very old dysfunctional building, and which also had brown water when you open the sink. So I said, I feel like I'm back home now at Juvenile Hall. So I started my teaching. I was teaching an introduction to the American legal system and included the U.S. Constitution and explaining it to my 30 to 35 students. And my students included other judges, there were professors, there were lawyers, and there were law students. And one of the things you learn is that the model in Eastern Europe and in Russia is law is usually taught as an undergraduate program, followed by some type of clerkship and apprenticeship in order to become a lawyer. So I had about 30 to 35 students in my class. And this was a time when there was a significant crackdown on protesters and people speaking out in Russia. So I wanted to be very cautious and circumspect on what I said in the classroom. And when I got to the First Amendment, what I noted was both Russia and the United States had a First Amendment. In fact, Russia's First Amendment is more robust than the U.S. Constitution. I said, but it's all about how it's applied and how it's implemented. And even when you have a robust constitutional protection, people's sometimes speech gets quashed. And I was trying to be circumspect. And then one of my students yelled out at me, he says, "You mean Pussy Riot?" And I said, "You said that. I didn't say that. But yes, that would be an example of how the First Amendment might be applied in Russia." So this campus at Far Eastern Federal University, also known as FIFU, which is where I taught, was dry. So the entire island was dry. So I ventured several times into Vladivostok itself to get a nice glass of vodka. It was about a half an hour bus ride. Beautiful city with Victorian architecture, very hilly, reminded me a lot actually of San Francisco. Probably not most people's image of Vladivostok, which they probably think is a barren outpost in Siberia. It is not. I did have an opportunity to get together with some of the other professors. I got together one evening with my students who took me on a tour of a nuclear submarine. I think one of our colleagues here talked about going on a ship. I got to go on an abandoned or decommissioned nuclear submarine, and then they took me out to a hookah bar and a restaurant. To be clear, that's hookah, not hooker. Hookah bar. And also faculty took me to Wildlife Preserve. They had Siberian tigers there and other exotic animals who were roaming free. Another day at a picnic on the water. Great experience, although I have to say that, Russians tend to be very reserved. And I'm a very gregarious, outgoing American, so we're trying to find our middle ground there. I taught there for 2 weeks, and then hopped on a train and headed west on the Trans-Siberian Railroad from Vladivostok to Moscow on a 6-day trip. So just a phenomenal experience overall. And it really gave me the opportunity to combine my two passions of travel and teaching. A couple of years later, I was assigned to the University of Szczecin in Szczecin, Poland. It's up north. It's due west of Gdansk that most other people are familiar with. It was, and I believe, Richard, you taught in that same program as well. It was a 6-week program, and there were 3 of us from SILS who each taught for 2 weeks. And my program was on U.S. constitutional law. I had approximately 15 to 20 students. The Polish students tend to be much more interactive. There's a lot more back and forth discussion, and that may have been either cultural or the fact that a much smaller class, but it was much more interactive than my experience in Russia, which tended to be more in the lecture style. Interestingly, I was put up in a Catholic seminary, which was an experience in itself. It wasn't very far from the university, and they housed me in the Archbishop's residence, which sounds luxurious, but actually it was only large. It was still quite Spartan. In fact, they joked and kind of apologized that I'd be sleeping in a single bed in the Archbishop's residence, and they said, "Hey, he's the Archbishop. He doesn't really need anything larger, does he?" So Strzelecin itself was a very beautiful city that had been largely destroyed during World War II and is now fully restored to its medieval and Renaissance glorious architecture. I went out a number of times with my contact professor. Typically, when you're part of the program, there's one person who's your contact person, usually another faculty member, and they're your guide. They check in with you, see if you have any needs, make sure you're comfortable, introduce you to students, arrange for some type of entertainment. And that's exactly what Paolo did. He was an Italian-Polish professor at the University of Strzelecin, very delightful and very hospitable. Following that, I was in Budapest for 3 times, 2018, 19, and then again last year in 2023. This was not directly a SILS program, but SILS provided me with the opportunity to teach at this master's in law program in Budapest, and which is just a stunning city where Dennis spends a significant part of his time. There was a question about how does this affect your opportunities to teach at a law school in the U.S.? And it's. I always found that when I'm involved in an employment situation and I want to hire somebody, I'm always looking for people who are interesting. What is your life experience? And this was just an amazing life experience that did it help me at Seattle U? Actually, the dean at the Seattle U knew the dean at FIFU, Far Eastern Federal University, and I was able to create some synergy between the two and try to open up a program, and then things got complicated politically. We don't need to go there. I recently was appointed to a 6-member international commission in Ukraine. I'm involved with recreating or reestablishing their Judicial Conduct Commission. And I think part of my appointment by USAID to that commission was the fact that I was on the commission in Washington State here for 14 years, but also the fact that I had all this experience in Eastern Europe, that I was familiar with their approach to the law, their judicial system, their legal system. And I was able to talk about those experiences before my appointment. And I think it really gave me a significant entree into receiving that appointment from USAID. So I'll maybe underscore what Julia said. It's a fantastic experience, can be life-changing for some. And I'm really happy to support this program and look forward to my next assignment. Thanks much.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to David Zarski. And then after that, we're going to go through this list of questions. Feel free to go into the chat and contribute to the conversation there, either as a questioner or as a person with an answer. And I'll just say really quickly, because I think David can introduce David better than I can, that David is a retired American lawyer and a former English solicitor and a professor, founder, and executive director of Embankment Financial Consulting, LLC. Please correct that introduction and add to it David Zarski.
Thanks, Diane. I appreciate it much. And I am a Chicago lawyer, Illinois licensed. I'm not in New York. So I'm not going to give any advice regarding New York law. So let me make that qualification clear. I have been an attorney for far too long. I'm a transactional guy. I am not a litigator. And for all of you listening in who are transactional lawyers, you are much wanted here, because it seems like litigators are much better teachers and lecturers than transactional guys are. So we have it a lot harder in terms of organizing a class and lecturing and timing and all of that. So it took me a long time to figure it out. But I've been participating in this program since 2006. The first school I taught at was in Petrozavodsk, Russia. And I was there for 6 weeks, and never again, never again, because as John said, it is very different in Russia. The next one I was at was in Warsaw, and because of my problems in Petrozavodsk, I only scheduled it for 2 weeks in Warsaw. And I was kicking myself afterwards because Warsaw was absolutely great. It seemed like it was a very young town, very energetic town, and my students were all fabulous. They loved Warsaw so much. They wanted to show me around. They were giving me advice on where to go, what to do. It was absolutely great. I would love to go back there. I'm Polish ancestry, and so I definitely would like to go back. I've not been to Krakow yet, and I absolutely want to go there as well. So Dennis, keep that on your list. But I have taught, as I said, in Petrozavodsk. I've taught in Warsaw. I've taught in Beijing, and then I've done remote courses in project finance, asset securitization, which was in Vienna. And then this coming spring, I'm scheduled to teach in Estonia, as I mentioned earlier. And I'm really looking forward to that. That should be a lot of fun. But when I taught securitization in Vienna last year, I had, and this was to both LLM students as well as practicing attorneys. And I had attorneys from 17 different countries participating. And so it was very interesting. One of the takeaways that I had, especially in that course, is there are varying levels of English speaking ability. And I will add that all the classes that I've taught have always been in English. And the students were usually pretty good on that. The biggest problem are specialized terms, legal terms that they may be unaware of. The other problem that I saw is that we may use terms, but and they use the same terms, but have slightly different meanings or shades of meanings. So it's a good idea to always remember that even though you say something and it's perfectly fine for you, they may not understand. So I always encouraged all of my students to ask questions, because I told them, if you have a question, the odds are that other students may have as well. And I have had classes as small as 4, which was 4 students in Petrozavodsk. And then I've had as many as 27, and that was in Beijing. And on the average, though, it tends to be around 15 to 17 altogether for most of my classes. And again, as John said, in Europe, law is an undergraduate program, and then LLM is the advanced degree. So I had students, most of the students I had in my courses were undergrad, mostly at the junior or 3rd year level. So they were all pretty good. And then I did use the Socratic method, one, because that They're not used to that. And two, that saved me from having to speak as much and straight lecture. And the other thing that I like doing with the Socratic method, and again, because we're common law and they're not, I would assign cases to students and then draw them out and make them recite the cases, the facts of the case, and then the basic holdings. And then I would ask them questions about it. And I didn't do a paper chase on them most of the time. I was usually pretty polite and pretty comfortable with them. So they weren't too nervous about it. But the first ones always were. Anytime you're the first, then after that, they go better. Now, my students in Beijing, I had 27 of them. So I wasn't able to do the Socratic method and assign them cases. And my course for that was comparative law for business associations. So I was discussing sole proprietorships, partnerships, corporations, LLCs, and I covered business organizations from several different countries, including the US, including several in Europe, as well as some in Asia as well. So it was an interesting course, and it was good for me too, because in any of these courses, I like to teach something that I'm comfortable with, but not totally knowledgeable. So it forces me to learn things as well. So it's good. And it again, as others have said, this has been truly all of these courses have been life experiences for me, which I absolutely enjoy. And then let me see. Oh, and already in Estonia, I've been in discussions with my contacts at the university, and they're very interested in putting me in touch with the principal regulators of banks and financial institutions in Estonia. They're going to set up a meeting with me, and then possibly even a 1 or 2 day conference with the regulator for bankers to come. So in addition to my teaching a course there, I will also be meeting with federal regulators there and discussing our program here, because I had been an attorney, a policy level attorney at the FDIC in Washington, D.C. for a term appointment. So I'm familiar with policy levels, and I'm familiar with that. So that's very helpful as well. Then as far as some of the logistics, once the topic is set, you work with the university on the duration and the lectures and things like that. You're responsible for coming up with the syllabus, the lecture plan, or the lesson plan, as well as the lectures itself. And again, I will, hopefully before we break, I will get my email information in the chat or in the Q&A. And like the rest of my colleagues up here, more than happy to answer any other questions you may have on this whole thing. Let me see if there's anything else. No, that pretty much covers the basic points. I just would like to add that this is not a holiday, okay? There is work involved in it, a fair bit of work that you need to do to prepare and then lecture. And then afterwards, for the students that are being graded, you're required to give an exam. And the students who are not pursuing this for their grades for a degree, they generally go pass-fail. So you have to grade exams as well. And we were talking amongst us earlier on, I normally like to give essay questions. And I was shocked and amazed to find that people are starting to use AI to write their essay questions. So I've had to stop and think how to handle that now. But again, it's life continues to move on. But again, as I said, this is not a holiday. This requires you to do work. But if done correctly, as others have said, this is truly a life-changing experience for both you as a teacher and hopefully the students. I have made friends and colleagues throughout the world. I was fortunate enough to have a teaching assistant the same teaching assistant for two of my classes. She's now a practicing attorney in Shanghai, and she is just great. I have another former student that I'm mentoring, and she's in Vietnam. So you literally can make friends from around the world and stay in contact with them. I just find it, as I said, life-changing for me. So thank you all, and I look forward to working with you sometime as part of this program.
Diane, this is Richard, can I just add a couple of quick points?
Sure.
So-
Yeah.
But just following up on something David was saying, it's really important in my experience to put together a draft syllabus that covers the main subject matter of each class well in advance and share it with the university, because they will have insights and ideas about how best to structure the course. What I also do, because this is an elective, in other words, the students have complete discretion as to whether to sign up for your 2-week course to supplement the regular curriculum. And so what I do in advance is prepare a letter to my prospective students that gets posted along with the draft of the syllabus, in which I introduce myself, explain what the goals of the course are, and sort of encourage them to add this to what in some instances is a pretty heavy course load that they already have. The last thing I would say, for those of you who are attracted to the idea of faculty housing, my experience, in all honesty, if you're thinking about this, the faculty housing is pretty dismal. And at least in the 3 schools where I've taught, my wife came with me and we looked at the faculty housing online, and she said, if I'm coming with you, we are staying in a hotel. And it was well worth it. It was great. But particularly in Ukraine and in Vilnius, the faculty housing is, if you're going to go with your spouse, plan on staying in a hotel.
Diane, if I could jump in for a second.
Sure.
Thank you. So I just want to be clear that we're giving you a lot of information. And I know that I think David mentioned, you need to be careful with languaging. We were taught in our orientation session to watch colloquialisms because they don't translate. So for example, you said, this judge was sharp as a tack. Well, that may not, the sharp as a tack may not mean much. I remember when I was in Russia, somebody said, I was opening a door and they said, you are strong like bull, smart like tractor. What does that mean? So I just want to assure everybody, and Dennis, you're doing the training, the orientation online now, is that correct?
We have an online orientation program.
So there's it's not like we're going. SILS is going to say, all right, you're assigned to Vilnius or you're assigned to Tallinn and Estonia, and create a syllabus and off you go. There's a robust training. It's extremely helpful. It addresses a lot of the issues that we talked about here, which is you're going into a civil law a society or a civil law training session, educational session coming from a common law country. Don't use colloquialisms. What do you put into your syllabus? How do you introduce yourselves? What you can expect in terms of housing? All of that was part of the training and orientation. So what we're trying to give you is just a flavor on our personal experiences, not to train you for going into your assignments whenever you may do that. So there's a lot more information that's available to you.
If I can also jump in really quickly, one of the tips that I did is when I am planning a new course that I had not taught before, I will generally go online to look at existing textbooks on the topic. And then what I'll do next is I also go online to see what I call real professors' syllabuses look like for that topic or a similar topic. So this way I can look to see what others have taught, what the case book or textbook says, as well as helping me draft my own syllabus. And I found that to be very helpful.
Yeah, David, let me just add two quick things because you're absolutely right. The other thing I found helpful, certainly if you're teaching a course like I did on American legal system and the Supreme Court, there are resources where you can learn something about the parallel legal system in the country in which you're teaching. And it's very, very helpful if you're planning a class about, say, the Supreme Court's views on gun control, to understand what's the law on gun control in Lithuania and the like, because then you're able to draw analogies or parallels or draw distinctions, and that frequently helps draw the students out.